Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon in relation to what is now the second webinar in relation to this important market access development for Australian exporters looking to export their wine into the European Union. For those of you that haven't met me before, by way of introduction, my name is Ned Hewitson and I'm an in-house counsel at Wine Australia, and today I'm joined by Dr. Eric Wilkes from the Australian Wine Research Institute. Wine Australia and the AWRI have been working closely together in relation to these matters, to great benefit. So it's great to have Eric join us today to present in relation to this issue. There's a pretty busy agenda to get through, as was the case with the last webinar. However, by way of housekeeping, before we get into things, it's important to note that you're welcome to submit questions into the chat function as part of this webinar. And we're hoping to have time at the end of the session to respond to the questions that do get answered. However, to the extent that we run out of time or need some further time to consider the right answer, we can do so after the event, and we'll circulate the answers to all webinar attendees. So absolutely, please feel free to ask questions as they arise. The other important thing to note is this webinar will be recorded for you to view at a later date. So to the extent that you're busy with vintage or otherwise engaged with things this afternoon, by all means, feel free to tune in on YouTube at a later date. Today's agenda is on the screen. I'll probably spend less time on sort of the background and timeline as I did at the first webinar, which we delivered back in late August last year, but really we'll provide a broad summary of the big picture, jump into some further detail, and crucially, at point 4 there, we'll provide an example label that we've been working hard on recently in collaboration with some international counterparts as well, and then go through some of these sort of ancillary considerations, and then crucially, after my slides are done, Eric, as set out at point 7 there, will run through some of the nuts and bolts of the data to help producers manage these new requirements. So we're hoping that packaged up, it'll be a really useful presentation. Before we do go any further, and as will soon become apparent, it's important to note this disclaimer, and in particular, really important to be engaging with your in-market representatives and considering seeking local advice, because things unfortunately do remain in a bit of a state of flux. Before we do get started with the key issues, I thought I'd point out some key resources, which are those set out on the slide. So Wine Australia's put out a series of guidance papers, which is the paper pictured on the slide there. Most recently updated, published today's date, to account for the very latest developments. But as developments continue to occur, it's important to subscribe to Wine Australia's Export and News newsletter, which is where we'll make the latest information available. In addition, as I foreshadowed, there's a bunch of AWRI resources which have been put together, including their technical review, as well as the fact sheet that we worked in collaboration on as well. So like I said, I won't go into too much detail regarding the background and timeline, but it does sort of paint a bit of a picture. So you can see that these reforms have sort of been in the works for a little while, and that things have considered to change, particularly as the commencement date of the new laws approached. So there was extensive consultation and indeed changes occurring to the European legislation through the back end of 2023, with the commencement date of the new laws being 8 December 2023. So it's been rapidly evolving, and as I noted, sort of in those last 2 dot points on the slide there, it does continue to evolve. So important to stay apprised of the latest facts as the developments occur, and of course, Wine Australia will be facilitating that by disseminating information via its export market guides and other methods. So in terms of the key points, this is really well, as I've called it, the 50 words or less summary. So for each SKU produced in the 2024 vintage and beyond, you must disclose a nutrition declaration, an energy value, and a list of ingredients. And you'll have the ability to choose whether to communicate that information on label or off label. So that's via electronic means, by providing a link or a QR code to that off-label information, provided that certain conditions are met. So that's the big picture. In terms of the application and commencement of the new requirements, there was a bit of uncertainty around this, but it's really clear to note that it does, of course, apply to all wine sold in the EU. So it's Australian wine, European wine, wine from the United States, New Zealand, South Africa, or anywhere else. But really importantly, it applies to wine which is produced on or after 8 December 2023 and not produced and labelled. Now, that's something that changed about midway through last year, but the European Commission has made that really clear that it applies to wine that's produced on or after that date. So the labelling date doesn't matter. What does the word produced mean? Is the natural next question in the context of wine, because things are often matured in either oak or in bottle for a protracted period. But it's been made really clear by the European Commission guidance that a wine is deemed produced once it's been essentially fermented or vinified. So that means that these new requirements apply to wine which is produced in the 2024 vintage and beyond. Wine which has been produced in prior years can continue to be sold into the EU until you've sold through those stocks. And this slide really just is to prove that I'm not a liar. And you can see there that on the left-hand side, that's the European Commission's amendment to the laws, which was on the 31st of July. I'm sort of just squinting to see that fine print. And then this is also the European Commission guidance as to when a wine is considered produced, and that's their guidance of late November last year. Of course, in that penultimate paragraph on the right-hand side, you can see there's commentary around sparkling wine, and indeed the same principles can be applied to fortified wine as well. So to the extent you're making sending sparkling wine or fortified wine to the EU, then please obviously have regard to that guidance there. So, like I said, there's a couple of aspects that are mandatory now for wine going into the EU. The first of which is a nutrition declaration. Now, the mandatory nutrition declaration must address those aspects which are laid out on the screen. Fat, saturates, protein, and salt. You sort of might raise a few eyebrows in the context of wine, and perhaps for good reason. So you see on this slide, this final paragraph where they contain negligible amounts of those substances, those substances, then it can be covered off by saying contains negligible amounts of, and that's where Eric's presentation, I think, will be very useful. In terms of the energy value that must be presented either on the label or, actually on the label for energy value, but as part of the new European requirements, that's how they've got to be presented. It's on a per 100 ml basis, expressed in kilojoules and calories as well. And the conversion factors are set out on the screen. Now, Eric will spend a lot more time unpicking the nutrition and energy related information later on in this webinar. So that's where I'll leave the energy value discussion for now. What is slightly more complicated is, in terms of the labelling, is the list of ingredients. It's a requirement that all of the ingredients of the wine are listed, but there's some exceptions which will be outlined on the following slide. It's important that there's a heading to accompany the list of ingredients, and there's in the context of wine that can be named in any order, that list of ingredients, except grapes will always be the first ingredient in the context of wine, because your other ingredients will constitute less than 2%. There's some flexibility built into the legislation, which is really encouraging and might allow at least a degree of standardisation across maybe vintage to vintage or across different blends as part of bigger blends. So that's encouraging, and I'd encourage you to consider Wine Australia's guidance for further detail in that respect. Now, I mentioned that all of the ingredients of the wine need to be called out on a list of ingredients, and what I mean there is that all additives need to be named, but not necessarily all processing aids. It's only those processing aids which might cause allergies or intolerances. Now, how to find out whether something is a processing aid or an additive for the purpose of European legislation is set out in this table here, which is straight out of their legislation, but also extracted into the Wine Australia's European Export Market Guide. And you can see in this column 5 and 6 on the screen, there's a cross in the box. For instance, I can see tartaric acid classified as an additive. So to the extent that tartaric acid was used in the production of the wine, it would need to be named in a list of ingredients. And like I said, whether only processing aids which cause allergies or intolerances will need to be called out. This table is also helpful in the context of what the name of the ingredient is. So it's not the brand name. It'll be the name of the specific compound. So again, tartaric acid, malic acid, lactic acid, etc., rather than a brand name. In terms of allergies and intolerances, and as is logical, these new requirements regarding listing ingredients doesn't necessarily affect those. They still need to be called out either in the list of ingredients if it's listed on, if it's communicated on label, and still needs to be on the label where the full list of ingredients is communicated off label. And of course, there's the prescribed name for sulfites, egg, and milk. And there's requirements around formatting, and often that will mean bolding, so it can be clearly distinguished from the remainder of the list of ingredients. Now, I mentioned that I mentioned there's some flexibility which might apply to certain additives that are used, but there's also some additional requirements which apply to additives which fall into these categories on the screen. So the categories of acidity regulators, preservatives, and antioxidants and stabilizing agents. And again, in order to get the category name, I'll just go back a couple of slides. The category name is that which is set out in this table as well. So you can see that you've got in that grey shaded row, we've got acidity regulator. That is the category name for these purposes. So to the extent that one of these substances has been used in the production of the wine, you must designate the name of the category and then the name of the substance or the E number. So there will be perhaps some commercial some flexibility regarding commercial decision making, whether E numbers are used or the name of the substance is used, and that could be dictated by labelling real estate, for example. Now, as I mentioned off the top, there's the ability to communicate the mandatory nutrition declaration and list of ingredients either on label or off label. Now, certain conditions apply to each of those. And really the key one is around language. And that's been a source of ongoing discussion in the European Union, especially insofar as off-label communication of a list of ingredients is concerned. So where information is provided on label, and this is where the information is provided on label, the information must appear in a language which is easily understood by the consumers of the EU member state where the wine is marketed. So obviously that means, to the extent you're selling into Spain and Portugal, for example, to adjacent countries where they speak Portuguese in Portugal and Spanish in Spain. So that will likely present some issues because you'll need to either have separate labels for each of those markets or communicate the required information in both Spanish and Portuguese, which depending on where you're selling your wine, is likely to encourage people to make use of the off-label or the ability to communicate these things, the mandatory information, via off-label means. As regards off-label communication of the mandatory information, the requirements are those which are set out on the slide. You can see that on the left-hand side, the left-hand column of the table is regarding list of ingredients. The right-hand is regarding the nutrition declaration. We can see the items 1, 2, and 3, and A, B, and C are identical. So there's a prohibition on displaying information with sales and information intended for sales and marketing purposes. You can't collect or track user data if you're providing these things on your website, for instance. And the information that you communicate to consumers off-label must be, as was the case with communicating on-label, must be understood by the consumers of the member state where the wine is marketed. So you can see in the context of various commercial providers of these QR code services for the wine industry, there's functionality inbuilt where scan the QR code and the information shows up on your smartphone, for instance, and depending on where you are in the world, the information will be translated into the relevant language depending on where you are. So in theory, you could walk across the border from Portugal to Spain, and the information would translate into from Spanish to Portuguese or vice versa. As I mentioned a few slides ago, and now looking at point 4 of the left-hand column, allergens must still be listed on label, even if you're communicating the list of ingredients off label. And importantly, at point 5 there, the QR code which links through to the off-label provision of list of ingredients must be accompanied by a heading that includes the word ingredients. This in particular has been a source of ongoing controversy, I'll call it, and ongoing advocacy efforts by those, especially within the European Union, because there's been a push for the use of what's called an I symbol for, I indicating I for information, but the European Commission has indicated that won't be sufficient for the time being, at least. There's some further information which follows on the next slides, but I'll get to that in a minute. In relation to the provision of a nutrition declaration by off-label means, and now looking at point D in that right-hand column, the energy value must still appear on label, which can be expressed by using the symbol E for energy. And I'll show you what that looks like in a few slides' time. And interestingly, it's sort of an interesting quirk of the European law, but if you're providing a nutrition declaration off-label, you don't need to, the European Commission has indicated that you will not necessarily need to also accompany that QR code with the words nutrition declaration. However, you can see there's a few asterisks on that slide, which is why it's important to conduct due diligence and liaise with your in-market representatives to try and keep up with the latest, because there's things which continue to change in relation to these laws, or be subject to ongoing consideration in relation to these laws. Now, the first asterisk there is in relation to the use of the I symbol. So if you're selling wine into Italy, the Italian government has indicated that the I symbol will be mandatory because that's part of communicating their waste and recycling requirements. And in relation to the use of the heading to accompany a QR code linking through to a list of ingredients, I mentioned on the previous slide that could just appear in one language of the European Union. So English would be quite convenient for Australian exporters, but we understand that some member states do not necessarily share the European Commission's view and consider that that accompanying text would need to appear in the language of the relevant member state where the wine is being marketed. Again, and sorry, at the last point there, so with the three stars next to it, is you recall on the previous slide, I mentioned the fact that the QR code communicating nutrition declaration, doesn't necessarily need to be accompanied by some text indicating that the nutrition declaration is being, housed by that QR code, call it. However, again, we understand some member states are requiring or seeking to require that text accompanying that link would also refer to the nutrition declaration. So as you can see, it's an ongoing, it's a bit of a moving feast still. And you can see on the right-hand side, we've got some minutes from the European Commission's expert group as recently as early February, sort of debating these issues and calling for more clarity from the European Commission. And we can see on the bottom right of that slide a letter from the 12th of March, or just early this month, outlining similar concerns. So it's subject to ongoing consideration and advocacy. And while of course I can't predict the future, I don't think I'd be surprised to see further changes occur to these laws ahead of the upcoming Northern Hemisphere harvest later this year. Eric's slides will cover, really a lot of detail regarding the calculation of the nutrition declaration and energy values. So I won't go into too much detail here, but what is worth mentioning is that you can see, if you compare the two nutrition declarations on the right-hand side of the slide, you've got the entire tabulated version at the top there, and then you've got a truncated version down below. So to the extent that you are looking to communicate these things on label, I'd encourage you to consider making use of a more truncated version, because that'll save you some label real estate. Now, I've got 3 example labels to run through, and the first one is how to communicate these things on label. So I appreciate that the font size is about size 2 on your computer screens at the moment. So I don't expect you to be able to read the detail or indeed see the detail on the label. But importantly, this example label is included in Wine Australia's EU export market guide, which was updated just yesterday in time for this webinar today. So that's available on the Wine Australia website. But it is worth noting that again, drawing your attention to the language requirements, which I referred to earlier. So everything on this label, this example label, is in English, and that's because we've said that it's being this particular sample wine is going to Malta, where English is an official language. So to the extent that you were sending this wine to, again, I'll use Spain, then all of these the mandatory information appearing, or the mandatory ingredient and nutrition information would need to appear in Spanish, for instance. So definitely keep that in mind. Again, we've included a truncated nutrition declaration here. And again, in relation to the list of ingredients, we've come up with sort of an illustrative example with the intention of providing a sort of one size fits most example, but consider whether you can make use of some of that flexibility that does exist within the legislation in the presentation of the particular list of ingredients that you are presenting. In relation to how this looks if you're making use of the QR code and communicating the mandatory information by electronic means, again, the same principles apply regarding it being a one size fits most example. But you can see there we've got the word ingredients accompanying the QR code on the screen. We can see that there's an allergen statement, despite the fact that an allergen statement appearing on label, with the list of ingredients being communicated via off-label means. We can see under the QR code we've got an E value communicating the amount of energy. Again, even though the full nutrition declaration is being presented communicated via electronic means, via that QR code. And again, there's you can see the word ingredients accompanying that QR code, but not necessarily nutrition declaration. Read this or use this example in conjunction with the remainder of the information in the export market guide, and we're hoping that it provides a useful resource. In terms of what this looks like when you are communicating information via off-label means, via the QR code, this is what it might look like on a smartphone. So you've got this essentially the same list of ingredients, the same nutrition declaration that was on the on-label example 2 slides ago. Before I get into the ancillary considerations, I can see that there's been a question in from Mel. Hi, Mel. That it says, is there a definition for collect and track user data? If the user is not identified, is this valid? Mel, unfortunately, I'm not well versed enough in the ins and outs of the IT law, but I do know, to answer that on the spot, but I do know that the question is addressed as part of the European Commission's 24 November guidance paper, which is annexed to Wine Australia's guidance paper. So I'd encourage you to do a Control F on that document. And to the extent that that doesn't help, then please get in touch with further questions. There's a couple of ancillary considerations to be aware of before I hand over to Eric. First of all, unfortunately, you will likely need entirely separate domestic and EU labels, and that's because even where you're communicating the information, the mandatory nutrition information via a QR code, the European legislation requires that energy value to be communicated on label. And as soon as you do that under Australian laws, it means that a full nutrition information panel will be required to appear on label. And then of course the Australian Nutrition Information Panel is not the same as the European Nutrition Declaration, so you won't be able to use those interchangeably across the markets, unfortunately. Secondly, in relation to products like vermouth, we've got similar but entirely separate rules applying in the European Union, so that's just something to be aware of there. Again, in relation to the on-label language requirements, the example that Wine Australia has made available in its export market guide is in English, but to the extent that you're seeking to sell your product in European markets where English isn't easily understood by those consumers, then you'll need to consider what language is necessary to communicate the information via. In relation to VI1 certificates, fortunately, the position for Australian exporters is much simpler than what is being faced by producers in probably 99% of the countries around the world, and that is that ingredients will only need to be communicated on VI1 certificates for bulk wine originating in Australia and produced on or after 8 December 2023. So again, that can be contrasted against the position for what producers from many other parts of the world are facing, which they're required to list ingredients on their VI1 certificates for packaged stock or packaged wine and bulk wine, whereas Australia, bulk wine only, and crucially, bulk wine produced on or after the relevant commencement date only. That's been a bit of a source of contention so far, but that's the way things are. So that's great for Australian producers. United Kingdom, of course, due to Brexit, the European rules don't apply in the United Kingdom. However, will apply to the extent that you're using, sending things to the United Kingdom and then on selling to the EU. And again, this does continue to be an evolving space in the European Union. Advocacy is ongoing. Due to the meaning of the word produced in the context of the commencement of these new requirements, it means that the Europeans, or all Northern Hemisphere producers for that matter, are not yet right at the coalface just yet. So there's still probably about 6 months for them to, before they're really grappling with these issues, or producers are really grappling with the issues in terms of making labelling decisions and so on. Continue to stay engaged with Wine Australia's materials and continue to liaise with your in-market representatives. And the last point there is it is an evolving space in terms of the rest of the world. And that's what the graphics on the screen demonstrate. We've had Food Standards Australia and New Zealand considering similar proposals over the course of the last year or so. And indeed, there's early stages of consultation occurring in the United States as well. Early stages at this stage, but it's something that's on the radar in Australia, in the United States, and in other places as well. I think this is my final slide. So just in terms of further information, I would reiterate what I had said earlier, which is to encourage you to consider Wine Australia's guidance paper, which is available on its website. which annexes the European Commission's Q&A document from last year, which provides answers to the sort of frequently asked questions. I'd encourage you to consider Wine Australia's EU export market guide for both the example wine labels that I referred to before, but also with lots of other useful information regarding the European Union and exporting wine there. I'd really encourage you to consider the material that the AWRI has made available, including the slides, which Eric will run through in a moment, as well as their technical review paper, among other materials, of course. Really do stay in close contact with your in-market representatives. Subscribe to Wine Australia's Export and News newsletter, which is where, as is pictured on the screen, we make things available in terms of make information available to exporters, as they arise. And to the extent that you still have questions after considering those materials, then feel free to reach out to Wine Australia via the email address on the screen. I'll now hand over to Eric Wilkes, who will run you through his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ned. That's a great presentation. And for once, I can be glad to say that I've got the easy bit, so it's all good. This is a disclaimer very similar to the one you saw at the beginning of Ned's presentation. This is the best information we have, but we really strongly recommend you stay in touch with your in-market representatives, because it is a bit of a moving target at times, and we know that there will be issues around interpretation, especially as the Northern Hemisphere wine production becomes involved in this, and then, we expect there to be changes as we go forward. So probably just want to reiterate as well, and Ned's already made this point, but this is only the first market to introduce energy and nutritional labelling and ingredient labelling through there. As far as nutritional labelling, which includes energy labelling, goes, we do expect it to become a regular thing on alcoholic beverages going forward. It's been the norm on other beverages and foods for a long time. So, it's not just going to be the EU going forward. Testing for this nutritional information in Australia can cost in the region of around $300 per wine. And that's just doing the basic work that's relevant for wine. So it's important that we understand the best way to comply with the new regulations while adding as little as cost as possible to most producers. And the nice thing for wine, in the case of the EU, is we can do that very, very cheaply, which is really nice. So just to make sure we had the right background information, in the last 12 months, AWRI has tested 66 wines through recognised testing of facilities which do a lot of nutritional testing. So these are using internationally accredited methods, etc. We've actually got that sample set up to over 100 now. I'm still doing some statistics on that, but it led to no change in our findings for these sort of things. The sample set included red and white and rosé wines, and 20 of these wines, so about a third, had less than 11% alcohol. And we also had a subset that were below 4.5% alcohol. So by our definition, probably not wine. So the first one we'll look at is fats and proteins. And this literally is the world's most boring table, because even I can't do statistics on zero. For fats, there is nothing to declare through that. For wines, we just don't find it. There are actually trivial amounts or vanishingly small amounts of fats and oils in wine, but it's well below the EU tolerances that we need to look for, which are listed up there. Those tolerances are in grams per 100 mils. So 1.5 grams per 100 mil would be 15 grams per litre. And if you had 15 grams per litre of fat in a bottle of wine, you would see a very serious scum sitting on the top, and you'd be very aware of it. So we're quite comfortable with that one. Now, despite what people may think, there is also protein in wine typically. In white wines, we usually try to remove it through bentonite fining, etc. But we do see small amounts remaining there. There are also small amounts of protein in red wines. It's just they're usually bound up to the tannins and so don't show up in the normal way, but they do exist in the materials. But once again, when we have a look at the average amounts we're seeing there, they're below the tolerances we need to declare. We're seeing an average value for wines of 0.02. So that's a very, very small amount, well below the tolerance that we need to concern ourselves with. So that's all really good news as far as doing these sort of things. And based on the table, so this is straight from the European regulations about what you can do, you can see that for fats, the EU rules show that we need to have if we've got less than 0.5 grams per 100 mils or grams, we can use 0. And similarly for protein. So based on this data, and we're very confident that for typical wines, so dry, semi-dry, and even semi-sweet wines, you do not have to test for or declare a number. So to Ned's earlier point, you can either use a truncated on-label thing saying there are negligible amounts of fats and proteins, or if you're doing an online one, you can use the term 0 happily in those without any concerns at all. Sodium and salt are a little bit different. We did the sodium and salt levels on the 66 wines I described earlier, but because I am that kind of person and I had the data available, we had a look at a set of 1,851 wines, which I consider to be a reasonable sized data set for Australia. And what we did see is that the average level of salt is 0.013, and the 95th percentile, so ruling out the outliers, is about 0.03 in the process. Now, once again, the EU tolerance that they accept for these measurements is very, very high, 0.375. So we're well below that tolerance. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind is, even though they have a tolerance of 0.375 and we've got an average number of 0.03, the actual limit for declaring 0 is 0.01. So their tolerance is a lot greater than their limit. And we are concerned that that could lead to some issues in interpretation for wines going into some markets. So while for the vast majority for many wines, I won't say the vast majority, you could happily declare 0.01 to cover yourself for salt levels. The safer choice would probably to go towards the upper end that we see for Australian wines and declare something like 0.03, keeping in mind that is still a vanishingly small amount of salt. For anyone who is interested as well, salt is defined in the regulations by taking the sodium value and multiplying it for a figure to give a salt value. So you don't need to measure anything like chlorides or anything in that sort of process. So yeah, our recommendation is, if you're not going to use a measured value, if you're not very clear on where your numbers lie, you can just use a generic value of 0.03 grams per 100 mils. Now, sugar and carbohydrates, while we have lots of really good information about the typical levels in Australian wines, everyone who is exporting their wine to Europe will have had to apply for an export license for that wine, and that would have involved them submitting a sugar value for it. So you will already have that number. It doesn't require extra analysis along those lines. So while 91% of Australian reds fall below the tolerances and 74% of whites, it's very easy just to put in that number that you have in grams per 100 mils, or you can make a declaration about it being 0 if it's below that 0.5 grams per 100 mils. I want to highlight once again, that's grams per 100 mils. Very few dry Australian wines, which are the majority of our wines, have 5 grams per litre of sugar in them. So once again, it's quite reasonable to put an average figure in there for those wines around that sort of process. For carbohydrates, it's a little bit different, and this is one of the areas where we run into differences in definitions between different regulatory bodies. So in Australia, you do not have to include glycerol as a carbohydrate, whereas you do in the EU. We have done a lot of work to have a look at typical numbers for glycerol in Australian wines, because we don't think it's reasonable that people will need to measure it for every wine, and it would be quite expensive. So out of that survey results, what we've shown, and this is, you'll see a technical review article referenced down the bottom there, which has all the information, is that using a typical glycerol value of 0.5 grams per 100 mils for white wines and 1 gram per 100 mils for red wines, you can then add that to your sugar value, and that will give you your carbohydrate number. So once again, if you know the sugar value, you can come up with the carbohydrate value just using those typical numbers. Because they're so low, they won't cause any grief in that part of the process. The tolerances for sugars and glycerols, the accuracy of the number is in the region of 20% in the regulations in Europe. So those numbers are fine. So calculating energy values, the next one through there. Once again, we have looked at thousands of wine and gone through the processes there. And the reality is, in the European context, given the information that we have, I'm not going to go through the details of this slide because you can read it at your leisure, be you that bored. More to the point is just all you really need to do is know your alcohol, which is by far the most significant contributor to energy in wine. The sugar value, which has a small contribution in everything except very sweet wines, where it will contribute a bigger number, but you just need those. And then you can use a generic number for both the organic acids, it's in the formula below, and a generic number for the glycerol component there. Okay, so you can multiply all those through, but the simplified version of these equations is listed down at the bottom of this slide. So for reds, it's the alcohol times 23 plus the sugar times 1.7 plus 8 plus 10. Similarly for whites, except it's plus 8 plus 5 because we have a lower glycerol content. One question I have got in the past when I presented this is the multiplier for glycerol. It has been pointed out that in Australia that the multiplier is 18. The Europeans use a different multiplier, which is 10, which leads to a different value compared to an Australian energy value. I will, however, point out that the impact of that is very small. And so if you have got a value calculated under the Food Standards Australia New Zealand rules, it would be adequate for use in the European sense. However, to do it totally correctly, use the formulas as I've laid out below here. So what, out of interest, does this mean for energy values in wines? And if you have a look at the box plot, it's been split up here for dry, semi-dry, semi-sweet, and sweet wines. And the reality is that the number doesn't vary very much. If you look at the histogram as well, you can see that it's very much wrapped around a very small bracket there. And this brings into play that, you know, we can actually quite reasonably use a generic number for energy. So you can, in theory, and it's some readings of EU regulations would suggest that you're encouraged to use a typical value. We don't say average values, we prefer to use the term typical, because that is relevant for the foods and beverages there. And I'd sort of point at the Commission notice that's here. Once again, I'm not going to read it in detail, but the Commission documents states that food business operators should act in good faith to ensure a high degree of accuracy of the nutritional declaration. In particular, declared values should be approximate to the average values across multiple batches and should not be established at either extreme or a defined tolerance range. In other words, you can use average values, but it's got to be done in good faith. So you can't go and choose the absolute lowest alcohol wine that you have in the range and say that's going to be a typical energy value. The other thing I'll point out, but is there is no tolerance for energy in EU regulations. There are tolerances for the amounts of protein, fats, sugars, all those other nutritional declarations. There is not a tolerance for energy, and because there is no tolerance for alcohol in that set of regulation, you can't just extrapolate through. But that being said, the vast majority of opinion and the rule of thumb used in the EU itself is that there is a acceptance of a 20% tolerance. As I said, that's not necessarily something that we can hang our hat on. But if we have a look at the typical values for a typical wine, white wine between 11 and 14% alcohol, which covers essentially 90% of Australian dry and semi-dry wines, and a very, very large proportion of our wines overall, we can use a value of 304 kilojoules per 100 mils, and absolutely all those wines fall within that 20% tolerance, and better than 95% fall within 10% tolerance. So if you have a typical wine, it's a reasonable expectation that you can use a typical value year on year, wine on wine, okay? If that wine falls out of that range of 11 to 14%, or if it's sweet, then you couldn't realistically use these numbers, but it is reasonable to assume, and I know an awful lot of European producers plan to use just the typical value for energy. We can make a very similar statement for red wines. Here we see that our typical wines are between 12.5 and 15.5% alcohol. And if we're talking about less than 12 grams of sugar, which is pretty well all the reds, apart from some semi-sweets and sweet ones, we can use a figure of 344 kilojoules per 100 mils. The differences between the white and red wines really does come down to the differences between typical alcohols. Now, we're not saying that you should use these typical values, and given how easy they are to calculate, using a calculated value is very much something that should be considered. But for convenience, it is quite reasonable to look at using a typical value such as this. So what would a typical nutritional panel look like for a red wine and white wine? I've done my best to put them up here, but as you can see, you can use a standard energy or value for both reds and whites, 0 grams for both fat subsets that we talk about. The carbohydrate will essentially always have a value because, especially for red wines, the glycerol contribution needs to be considered. The sugar value, you can say, generally is less than 0.1 or 0.1, depending on the average, but that's based on these typical wines here. As I said, every winery exporting wine to the EU will know what the sugar value is, so you can put that number in. And we suggest that if you're going to use a typical value for salt, you look at a number like 0.03. But if you are confident that your wines are much closer to the 0.01, then feel free to use that. And that can be based on just putting together the typical sodium levels you see for your wines over a period of time. We do know that sodium and salt levels tend to be very much linked to the region and the actual vineyard through there. So the numbers tend to stay the same vintage on vintage, within reason. So in summary, it's very reasonable to say that fats and saturates for Australian wines can be labelled as 0 grams per 100 mils or contains negligible values. Proteins, once again, similar sort of statement through there. It's not saying that there is no protein in wines, it's just below the tolerance that needs to be reported. And we suggest a figure of around 0.03 grams per 100 mils for salt. Sugars can simply use the analysed value, or if they're less than 5 grams per litre, you can make that zero declaration. Carbohydrates, please just declare them based on typical values of glycerol, as we found in our survey. And if you do not want to make the effort of doing an energy calculation, if the wine falls within that typical set of sugar and alcohol values, it does seem reasonable to use a typical value as listed there. But it is very easy to calculate energy values from the ABV and sugar. Most laboratories are moving towards providing this information as part of their standard C of A's, and we will be also providing a typical nutritional panel certificate as an add-on for these sort of things going forward. If people want to ask for it, it will be all these things at extra cost, but they will be available if people want to. But I would strongly recommend that, given this information, you don't need to pay extra money to get this sort of information. You can use these sort of values. And I think that's pretty all covers there. Here are just some considerations through there. If your wine is outside of those ranges, please, you need to have a serious look at what they are. If they're outside of those ranges, you can still develop your own typical values, but that work needs to be done. You can't take it from the work that we've done this. And I will emphasize, please don't overthink these nutritional information. Use the simplest possible approach wherever you can, because it will save you money and probably stress in the long run. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. Now, I think we've got 5 minutes left in the allocated time, which I might use to just see if I can answer any of the further questions that came through. Now, one of them says, to your knowledge, could the information required be supplied in a smaller additional label included as well as the domestic original back label? Now, that would depend on the specific domestic back label, and would also depend on what the additional information required to be supplied was. Now, assuming that it was a fairly standard domestic back label, and you were just seeking to communicate the nutrition and ingredient information via an additional back label, then I'm confident that just please check the European Commission's guidance, which again is annexed to Wine Australia's guidance paper. But I'm confident that you can communicate that information via an additional sticker, and that's the case whether you're communicating the information itself on label, or whether that's via an additional sticker that includes a QR code. Again, I'm confident in relation to that answer, but I don't have the European Commission guidance in front of me, and I'd encourage you to check that guidance, because I do know that it is addressed in that guidance. And they were all the questions. So thank you very much to everybody who joined us today. We hope that you found that to be a useful presentation. Again, I'd encourage you to revisit this recording and utilise the resources that Wine Australia and the AWRI make available in helping you navigate these new changes. We understand that these are fairly, they're massive changes and they're pretty complicated. But as Eric says, it's sort of important to not overthink things, and we're absolutely here to help. So please reach out as needed. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.